Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Single Tracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest is Ned Overend. Ned is a mountain bike Hall of Famer and highly accomplished racer, winning the first ever UCI Mountain Bike World Championship in 1990, the XTERRA World Championship in 1998 and 99, and also the UCI Masters World Cyclocross Championship in 2012. Today, he's the Specialized Cross Country Mountain Bike Team captain and lives in Durango, Colorado. Thanks for joining us, Ned.
Yeah, great to be here.
So, I read that growing up, you lived in several countries all around the world. How'd you end up settling in tiny, out of the way Durango?
Well, my dad worked for the State Department. So I was born in Taiwan, and in between these trips to different countries, we would live in Bethesda, Maryland, because it was close to Washington, D.C., the headquarters for the State Department. And we'd be in Maryland for a couple of years, and then we'd go for 3 or 4 years overseas. And we lived in Tehran, which was pretty interesting. And we also lived in Ethiopia for 3.5 years.
Wow.
And also something that we would do is, that you get a couple months R&R, they call it, when you work for the government overseas. And during these couple of months, my parents would take the whole family, and there were 6 of us, 6 kids, and they would travel to some exotic places. We went to the Seychelles Islands. We did a lot of trips through Europe and stuff like that. Pretty amazing that my parents would drag six kids to all these different places. So we ended up doing a lot of traveling. When my dad retired, we moved to the Bay Area, and I went to College of Marin, and then I went to San Diego State. And I had done some running. I was mainly a runner, and in college and in junior college and high school and stuff, and a pretty well accomplished runner, mainly cross country, and loved running in Marin in particular, right? I mean, they've got some amazing trails through the redwoods and stuff in Marin. Trails that are mostly illegal to mountain bikes. But
right.
Then I went to San Diego State, and when I was in a sporting goods store in San Diego State, I saw a flyer for the International Alpine School. And they were having an ice climbing class, which was in Ouray, Colorado. And San Diego was kind of too big for me. I knew I wanted to get more into the mountains. And my wife, Pam, she was my girlfriend at the time. I said, let's move to Colorado. So we did a lap around Colorado, and we went to Boulder, Gunnison, Colorado Springs, and Durango, and decided, hey, let's move to Durango. They had a hospital. She was a nurse at the time. I was also a car and motorcycle mechanic, so I got a job as a car mechanic there. Not really intending to be a professional athlete at that time, but we ended up in Durango, and we liked it. We liked the fact that the winters weren't too harsh because it's 6,500 feet. So, it's not as high as Vail. It doesn't get as much snow as some of those, higher ski towns. Plus, it was pretty close to the desert. So we figured we'd want to get a break from winter, because neither of us had lived in a winter environment before, in California. So, so we chose Durango, and it took a little while for it to grow on us, but it's we're glad we did.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I'm curious too. When you were growing up, I mean, moving kind of all over the world, did you have a bike? Like, did you grow up with bikes at all, or was that like too much of a luxury back then?
No, I didn't. I had a fat tire single speed in Ethiopia. And I actually have a picture of me on a 3-wheel trike in Tehran, but I don't really remember riding it that much. I was pretty young at the time. But I did ride this fat tire single speed in Ethiopia, but mainly just, we had a long driveway and it was dirt, and that bike had a flat tire. sat at a flat tire for a long time. But I had a horse in Ethiopia. We actually had,
Oh, wow.
our family had 3 horses. So I was actually spending, if I wanted to go out and explore something, I could take a horse and go do it. We lived out in the country outside of Addis Ababa, so it was pretty remote.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. Also, it sounds like, so you went to school in Marin. I mean, was that around the time that mountain biking was getting started? Were you aware of it, or like what was happening there at the time?
I was not aware of mountain biking at all in high school. I graduated in '73, so
Okay.
before the mountain bike time, but also I had a buddy of mine, Lars Moller, who was from Sweden, and he bought a Crescent bicycle, and the bicycle was too small for him, so I bought it from him. He had gone back to Sweden and bought it. Had camping equipment and tubular tires on it even, and so it was a nice bike, and it was literally my first, not my first bike, but my first bike since riding like a paperboy bike as a kid.
Yeah.
And we were on the cross country team, so I was, I was into training and was pretty athletic, and started riding that bike around Marin, and I rode it on the fire roads in Marin. Another bike that had flat tires pretty often, but I figured out I had to do tubular repair, so I got pretty good at that.
Yeah.
Because definitely ended up with a lot of punctures before and I raced that bike when I got into bike racing. I had that bike for a long time. When I moved to Durango, I had it, and ended up racing the road race to Silverton, which is one of the events that really got me into bike racing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I'm curious about mountain biking specifically. Like, when did you hear about that term and think about, riding off road and maybe even racing off road? What was kind of your introduction to the sport?
So in 1983, I moved to Durango in 1980 and was working as a automotive mechanic. And in 1983, I had been running, and like all runners, I got injured. So I started road biking because there was a road race in Durango, the Durango to Silverton road race, 50 miles, 11,000 foot pass, and
Wow.
super mountainous road race. But, because this race was promoted, it was, it caught my eye, and I was a good climber in running. So I took to road racing immediately, especially these mountainous Colorado road races. And I was doing well. I went from a Cat 4 to a Cat 1 the first year. And in 1983, I actually did the Coors Classic on the Raleigh team. With some famous riders. It was Thurlow Rogers, Andy Hampston, who went on to win the Giro. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to quit working as a mechanic, start working at the bike shop, the Schwinn dealer, and focus on trying to become a road racer or potentially a triathlete. I was also doing some triathlons, right? Because I was running and cycling, so I was doing some swimming.
Yeah.
And about that time, mountain bikes started showing up on the showroom floor. And I worked at a Schwinn dealer, and I think the first one might have been a High Sierra or something called a King Sting. Really early mountain bikes. And I thought, this is fun, because I also, something I hadn't mentioned, but I had a motocross background when I was in high school. I did some motocross racing, and I was a motorcycle mechanic. I actually was trained as a mechanic. But so I kind of knew how to, put the bike together and kind of modify it, because in the early days there was a lot of wrenching on your own bikes to keep it running. They were pretty primitive.
Yeah.
But I thought, this is great. And then I noticed that there were some mountain bike races starting to crop up. Right, I was always reading about the racing because I was looking at being a road racer, and I went out to California and did the Pacific Sun Tour Series on my stock Schwinn High Sierra, and I ended up winning a couple of the races, and I won that series overall. And I'm going to say that was 1983.
Wow.
And it was against guys like Joe Murray, George Theobald, Roy Rivers, Steve Cook. I don't know if these names, ring a bell with anybody, but the early days. And
yeah.
Fisher sponsored a team. Ross sponsored a team. Tom Ritchie sponsored a team. Specialized sponsored a team. Schwinn did not have a team yet. So I called Schwinn with these results that I had, talked to Fred Teeman, and he said, we were thinking about starting a team, so let's do it. Because I had some great results right away. And, they started paying my way to a few races and a couple $100 start money and some bonus. And that's how it started. So I started racing for Schwinn in 1984. But the combination of having some motocross skills, along with being a mechanic and hill climbing on the road bike as well, having trained on the road bike, it was kind of a great combination for jumping right into mountain bike racing.
Yeah, that's so cool. So you mentioned that you had a running background and that you were good at climbing, running and on road bikes. And I noticed that you've won a number of bicycle hill climb races, which that sounds absolutely brutal, especially to mountain bikers, right? Because, most of us ride uphill just so we can go down and have some fun. So I'm curious, how do you train for a hill climb race? Like, just going straight up and not worrying about the downs. Is it any different from training for like a normal race?
Well, I think it's important to try and mimic the course you're going to be riding on. So it's, and that's tough for a lot of people. I mean, it's easy living in Durango, right? We have some long climbs in Durango. We're fortunate.
Yeah.
And I had actually realized I was good at running uphill when I was running cross country in Marin. A lot of the, I was pretty good on the cross country team. But in Marin, a lot of the cross-country courses that we were racing in college were, they tend to be rolling. They don't tend to be hill climbs. And we had a multi-school event in Yosemite Valley. And there was a 10-mile run one morning, and we had like 5 schools, and it was to the top of Glacier Point from Yosemite Valley. And I had been getting maybe top 10 in some of the 5K races, which required more leg speed. But I found that I ran up Glacier Point and I won, and it wasn't that hard. It seemed less hard than running in the valley, in the flats at a higher speed. So that was the kind of one of the first times I realized that the power to weight climbing thing seems to suit me. And I went on to win several mountain runs, and in Colorado I was second in the Pikes Peak Marathon twice before again getting injured and switching to bikes. But it's important, so I was doing intervals on climbs as a runner before I ever started mountain or bicycle hill climbs. And one way I like to train on them is that in a race you'll find that you'll be on a climb and people will be surging, or the steepness will change and it'll be undulating but still climbing all the time. And what I would do is find a long climb, do intervals within that climb, several of them, maybe 4, let's say 2-minute intervals. And at the end of those 2 minutes, I would be pretty well maxed out. And I would give myself a minute recovery. But at the same time, I would still be going uphill, right? So I was forcing my body to recover while it was still under the stress of climbing. And I think that kind of interval really helped me, because it really mimics a race situation, where somebody may surge or you have a steep part of the climb, so you have to go harder, but then you need to continue at a pretty good pace and try and recover while you're actually climbing. So, I mean, that's just one technique I had. I am a perceived effort climber. So I don't use a watt meter and I don't use a heart rate monitor. So I train based on how I feel. So it's a little hard to extrapolate that into this is how people should train, if you know what I mean. I mean, I'm an advocate of heart rate monitors and watt meters for sure. I think they're really invaluable training tools, but perceived effort climbing or training has worked for me.
Yeah, interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, I know for a lot of people, I mean, for one, most people don't enjoy climbing. And then there's also sort of a lot of people kind of put themselves into a category of like, I'm good at climbing or I'm not good at climbing. And it's interesting, you know, your experience talking about that race in Yosemite, where, I mean, it almost sounds like you kind of surprised yourself at like how good you were at it. Do you think genetics plays a role? Like, is that some people are just naturally going to be better at it and it's going to be easier for them? Or is that something that, you know, someone who would say, oh, I'm a terrible climber, like, can they become a really great climber?
I think there's a lot of things that play into it. Genetics, I'm not sure how they necessarily affect you, but I'm absolutely sure that, you know, athletic ability and genetics, you know, are connected. Now,
Yeah.
myself, I don't, I don't have other family members that have shown, you know, talent. My dad actually passed from a heart attack when he was 56 years old,
Oh,
his
wow.
third heart attack at that time.
Wow.
So, of course, that's different. I mean, he worked his whole life. He wasn't into training. He didn't have a really unhealthy lifestyle. I mean, he didn't smoke or drink,
Yeah.
but he was high stress. And I think at the time when he died, you know, they weren't doing stents and they didn't have statins, you know, so his life could have been prolonged for a long time, I think, if, you know, with more
Yeah.
modern medicine. But the so genetics, I'm sure it plays a part. I'm not that qualified to speak exactly how, but one thing that definitely plays a part is mentally, you do have to believe, you know, that you can achieve it, and you really have to embrace the hard training. And ways that I've done that are, I think my attitude towards hard intervals and pain is I've actually grown to love that aspect of training. And I think what I think is that while I'm training and while I'm really pushing hard and it's painful, to me it's a positive thing because I say to myself, okay, this is what's really going to make you better. This is what's going to make a difference. This is what's going to develop my cardiovascular system, and this is going to pay off, right? So, and also I like the fatigue, the satisfaction of having a hard workout afterwards, you know, when you're really tired and you feel like you've accomplished something physically, you know, because you've pushed yourself and you know, and then with proper rest, you're going to be more fit. So I've got a good attitude towards pain and hard training. And also somewhere along the line, and I'm not quite sure where exactly I developed it. I mean, I had results, but I started thinking of myself as a guy who is going to win, right? That is what I'm going to, that is going to be my goal for the races. You know, not to do well, not to get on the podium, but to win. And, you know, I've had some success with it, and success obviously, you know, breeds that kind of motivation. So, of winning. But yeah, and I had success in running races, mountain running races, and had success early on in bicycle races, and then just continued to think of myself as, okay, my goal is to win. And you also have to look at when you don't win, how you react to that, right? Because obviously you're not going to win all the time. And I have races when I've been bad, and I think what I do is you have to examine what went wrong in that race, you know, and maybe nothing went wrong, but you know, you just weren't properly prepared for it, you know, and adjust your training or your pre-race prep to solve whatever problem you had. And I've been really good at saying, okay, I didn't perform that well, but I can still improve on that, and maybe I can, maybe I can't. As I get older, maybe I'm not going to improve on it, but I go ahead and tell myself I can improve on it, so I'm essentially fooling myself. You don't want to fool yourself too much, but, trying to have a short memory from my failures so I'm motivated to try again to improve my performance. Instead of saying, I wasn't that good last time, I guess I'm just not going to be able to perform at that level. Instead, I forget about that, and I'm like, okay, fresh slate. We're going to try again. If you know what I mean. I'm trying to... some of the attitudes that I think have led to my success over the years and longevity. So not just genetics, but mental, and obviously taking care of yourself and the proper training adapted to the individual.
Yeah, it sounds like the mental game is a huge part of it. And it also, I mean, did you figure a lot of this stuff out on your own, or did you have a coach that was able to kind of help you figure this out, or other athletes maybe even that were sort of mentors for you?
I got the information from all over the place. I didn't have a coach who specifically coached me and gave me a training program, but I've known many coaches, and I've always tried to learn as much as I can from them. I've read Eddie Borsowitz's book. I mean, there's so many coaching books. I read the books and I try and glean information from them that pertains to me. Like Joe Friel, Fast After 50. Joe Friel, I think, has got some great coaching information, and he presents it in a way that's very easy to understand. So I've adapted people's coaching techniques to myself. Plus, also have learned a lot from successful athletes that I've been around over the years. Guys like Christoph Sauser and Todd Wells. And so just kind of gleaned information from all different sources to try and apply to my situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, your book, Mountain Bike Like a Champion, I know is one that I've personally read. I think I was actually looking it up the other day, and Amazon told me that I bought it in 2004. So that was almost 20 years ago that I bought that book. But yeah, I mean, still such a relevant text, and, inspiring like the next generation of mountain bike athletes. And then obviously you as a coach now, being able to share all that information. Do you think mountain biking is different now, like because we have those resources than kind of when you were starting out?
Yeah, I think there's definitely more information, not just for mountain biking, but I think for all athletic sports, right? There's been a lot more testing, as far as nutrition, especially, and different methods of training, different methods of recovery. So, and especially the equipment changes of mountain biking have been pretty drastic, of course. So yeah, different information and a lot of information to learn from, and it's important, I think, to look at as many sources of information as you can to try and.
So looking at your resume, I mean, I'm just fascinated by the number of sports and disciplines, even within mountain biking or within cycling, that you've been able to have, tons of success in. And one of the more recent ones was 2015. You became the U.S. National Fat Bike Champion. So how did you get into fat biking? Like, what made you want to give that a try in 2015? And is it all that different from cross country racing, or is it kind of just the same thing but on snow?
It's got some similarities to cross country racing, but some things, of course, are very different. And what got me into fat biking, I had always kind of looked at it, and the fat bike races I had looked at was the Fat Bike Berkey, which is really the Super Bowl of fat biking. And it's in Wisconsin, and it's on the Birkebeiner ski course. And I've done the Birkebeiner a couple of times. You know, it's a 60K cross-country ski race. So I was familiar kind of with the terrain and with that race. And then I noticed that they were racing fat bikes on, and it's a big event. I mean, at that time, they would have 600 or 700 people on the start line. Now it's well over 1,000. So it's a big event. So that kind of interested me. Plus, you know, the fact that it was on the Birkie course. But I didn't actually pull the trigger because we didn't make a fat bike at Specialized. And one of the things that has kept me interested in cycling in longevity is the fact that I work for Specialized. And I mean, I like riding all the different disciplines, road, cyclocross, you know, obviously mountain bike, but also, you know, fat bike as well. And they said, we're thinking about building a fat bike. You know, you live in Colorado. Can you go to some events and help us out with this, you know, and kind of figure out what the geometry needs to be and, you know, what size wheel is ideal and different things like that. So, I mean, I really embrace that. So I think the first fat bike race I did was in Steamboat, and it was pretty cool. They actually had fat bikes and Nordic skiers on the course at the same time. It was pretty crazy. And because Nordic skiers, if you've been around, I mean, they have really long ski poles, Nordic skiers, and they're swinging them way out there. And I remember trying to have to time some passing with these Nordic skiers. They didn't want to give an inch. They didn't want bikes passing. It's very unusual to have skiers and bikes on the course at the same time.
Yeah, because the skiers are worried you're going to mess up the snow for them too, right? So they probably really didn't want to be behind you.
Yeah, this was in the early days. You don't. I've never really seen another race that does that. But they, you know, Steamboat was doing something unique. But it was interesting and fun. It's exciting. You'd be surprised. Most people who haven't ridden fat bikes at how fast fat bikes are. I mean, literally 40 plus miles per hour on the downhills. If you know, you look at their Strava, and those tires glide over the snow really quickly. And you know, of course, it's all different snow conditions, but you can have snow conditions that are super fast.
Yeah.
So, that's what got me into it. Was they asked me to help them develop it, and of course, you know, they also want to have help marketing it. And there's no better marketing, really, I think, for a fat bike that's going to be used in races, of course, except for someone who does well in races, right? So winning races. So I went back and did the fat bike Birkie the year after that. And I think I was still, may have been on an aluminum frame at that time. We started out making an aluminum fat bike before we went to carbon. And the fat bike Birkie, they were calling themselves the national championships, although they are not a UCI or a USA Cycling sanctioned race. So, I mean, but they gave out a jersey and the whole 9 yards. But you know, there was like 800 guys on the line starting that race. And the Midwest is really where fat biking has grown up and where it thrives. They have some fat biking in the Rockies, but the Midwest is really where it's happening. So that was really a big deal for me to win the fat bike Birkie. And then the year after that, USA Cycling said, okay, we better, you know, fat biking's popular. We better have a national championships. That one was in Utah, which was at a ski area. So that suited me even better, I think, because there was a lot of climbing, high altitude and that. And I won that fat bike race as well. But the Birkie was really more satisfying because it had a much bigger field and the guys in the Midwest are fast. But it's interesting when you say, how is it different? The terrain is, you're never fully connected to the ground, right? Because there's always a little bit of slip there. So, for instance, in the fat bike Birkie, there was a couple inches of fresh snow and a lot of turns, a lot of undulating terrain and turns. So literally, as you're pedaling through these turns at a pretty good speed, like 20, 25 miles an hour, you're drifting. So you just have to keep the power on. If you stop pedaling, you know, you're just going to lose all momentum. So it was a matter of drifting all over the place. Now, it's a controlled drift with fat biking. If people have ridden those, they know that you're riding 4 or 5 PSI in the tire. So you've got great traction, but it's not fully connected to the snow. But it's controllable. You're not like,
Right.
you're not having even that many near misses, if you've got your tires set up right. But tire setup is key in fat bike. And so being able to put your power to the snow, as it were, is really important in fat biking. I think there's a little extra resistance, so it probably suits a guy who's climbing, maybe similar to climbing. But, obviously it's not rough when you're fat biking on snow, but all your suspension is in the tires, and that's generally enough. So it's a little different in that respect,
right?
Technically. What they've started doing is doing fat bike single track, and actually have these special machines, that are with a 2-foot wide pulley that they drag behind the snowmobile, and they're packing single track. And they try and put single track races or single track sections in the fat bike races now, which makes them much more interesting and more technical.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like the main technical aspect of a lot of those races is just the bike handling. It's learning to, like you said, control your bike, and cornering and all those things are a little bit different. Not necessarily technical, but just kind of a different bike handling skill.
It's a different kind of technique, for sure. But it is bike handling skill.
Yeah, very cool. So I want to talk a little bit about Durango. Durango is promoting Spoketober next month, and that's the community's first annual cycling celebration. So tell us a little bit about the local cycling community in Durango. How's it grown and changed over the years since you first arrived?
Yeah, Durango has an incredible bike culture. And, it had some bike culture when I first arrived there in 1980. And Ed Zink was the guy who started and promoted the Iron Horse Classic, right? And I don't think race promoters get enough credit, right? I think a lot of times it's a tough job. They got a lot of bike racers who are complaining about how slow the results came out or how much the entropy was or stuff. But if you think about it, without the promoters, we don't really have a sport. The early promoters of Mammoth and Big Bear and Durango, mountain biking was created out of the sport of racing. It started with the very first guys on repack, right? The repack downhill in Marin County. So the promoters deserve a lot of credit. I mean, that's what got me into cycling, seeing this event that they were having in Durango. So the promotion of races in Durango brought attention to Durango as a cycling town, right? And the Ed Zink, the promoter who also owns the Mountain Bike Specialist, now Ed passed away a couple years ago, but his wife Patty is the current owner. Ed also had the foresight to, once mountain bike started growing there, to start a trails advocacy group it was called Trails 2000 at the time. Right now it's called Durango Trails. The head of that group currently is Travis Brown's wife, Mary Monroe Brown. So, but we've been fortunate that a lot of people have joined the group. It's got a lot of political clout, so that it's interesting. In Durango, if somebody wants to build a housing development, the city council will come to the Durango Trails group and say, "What do you think about this? Do we need trail easements through there?" It's kind of the reverse of the way it is in other cities. So we're very fortunate because, and one reason that Visit Durango has started Spoketober to celebrate cycling is because cycling is very important to the economy of Durango. It's a destination mountain bike spot. The people who live there, I think there's like over 500 kids in the Durango Devo program, which starts from everything from push bikes on up to the high school race team. And that's a big number. We're a town of 20,000 people. So there's so many aspects to it. But early on, they recognized that having quality trails was important for the cycling community, for the people who wanted to move there, for the people, the quality of life for the people who live there. So you have the race promotion, you have the trail advocacy, you have people who started Durango Devo, which is Sarah Tesher and Chad Cheney, and they started with the attitude, they were both racers themselves, but their attitude for Durango Devo is, this is about having fun. The primary goal here is for kids to love to learn to love bikes, right? They have a saying, it's NFTF, which stands for never forget the feeling, and never forget the feeling of the first time you rode a bike. So it's pretty cool. So that same philosophy is similar to NICA's philosophy, right? NICA high school racing, you know, they have a motto, which is there is no bench. And by that, they mean there's no bench warmers. Everybody rides, right? Everybody races. So all these different groups really helped create the current culture of cycling in Durango. On top of that, Fort Lewis Cycling, more national collegiate cycling championships than any other school in the country. And it's not a big school. So all of these things have created pros that want to come there, train, because of the great trails. The altitude is a good height for training. And they live there, and I don't know, the whole mix has been amazing. I mean, we have created Durango. I'm going to make this statement that more talent for, I think, road and mountain bike, especially mountain bike, has come out of Durango than any other city in the country and in a lot of places in the world. I mean, it's turning out that now we are competitive worldwide. You know, with kids like Chris Blevins and Riley Amos, and on the mountainside, roadside, the kids are coming out of Durango. Sepp Kuss, Quinn Simmons, so some world-class road racers as well. Road racers that used to be mountain bike racers.
Right. Well, yeah, I wanted to ask you what it was like last year seeing Christopher Blevins become the first American to win a World Cup mountain bike race since, I think, 94. What was that like to see him up there?
It was 94, and I was one of the guys who won a World Cup in 94. There was three of us. So Chris Blevins won at Snowshoe, the World Cup and the UCI World Cup this past summer, a couple months ago. And it was the first time an American had won a World Cup since 1994, which seems crazy, really, but it's been that long. And you know, we have so many bike racers in the U.S., mountain bike racers. But in 94, John Tomac won a World Cup. I won 2 World Cups, one in Switzerland and one in Italy. And then I believe Tinker won the World Cup finals in Vail. So Tinker was actually the last one to win a World Cup, but we all won in that season.
Yeah. But 3 in 1 year. I didn't realize that all 3 of you had won in 94. So then what happened after 94?
It gets a little complicated, but I would say EPO happened. That definitely had an effect on it. And I'm not just casting aspersions. I mean, there was, you know, whether it's Jerome Chiotti or several other athletes that went on to be discovered to test positive. You know, so I'm not just making accusations about EPO. So and that really is the year that it started making a big difference. And it was very discouraging to a lot of American racers who kind of stopped doing the World Cup because for several years there, they didn't have a test for EPO. But it had come, I think it kind of bled over from the roadside where obviously they had a serious problem with it as well. But not to go too far down that. I think they solved that problem for the most part with better drug testing and stuff like that. But we still didn't win any World Cups. And I think it's partially one of the reasons that we haven't been successful is that the teams, the sponsors haven't invested in having U.S. athletes racing a lot in Europe. It's expensive. They're not getting results because they're not living and racing over there, right? So you need to make a several-year investment before the riders can rise to the level to be able to compete at that level on those courses. So they just weren't making that investment. I think what's changed that is, for one thing, NICA high school racing. There is a much bigger pool of junior racers that have developed, right? The cream rises to the top. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so competitive over here now because of NICA, that we now have globally competitive mountain bike racers, like Christopher Blevins, Riley Amos. And if you look at Kate Courtney, she was a NICA high school racer as well. And Haley Batten, also probably two of the best. And the women have fared better than the men for sure over the years. But now we have both men and women who are competitive. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Well, what did you enjoy most about racing at that World Cup level?
Well, it was hard to win in Europe. So it was, I won the World Championships in 1990, and that was a big deal. I'd won several World Championships, actually 3 before that, but they were not UCI recognized World Championships. Before 1990, starting in 87, we would have 2 World Championships, one in Europe and then one in Mammoth. They would call themselves the Worlds. And they were very competitive races. They tended to be the most competitive races. But it was a little wonky, right? Because you had 2 World Championships. And 1990 was important for me to actually win what people were calling a real World Championships. So that was an important race, right? You have, World Championship stripes on your sleeve for the rest of your career and stuff like that. And people recognize that term, World Champion. But really, those World Cups I won in 1994, one in Italy and one in Switzerland, it was more competitive then, because in the early 90s, mountain biking blew up. You would actually have to have a qualifier to get the field down to like 100 guys. A couple of hundred racers would show up to try and race the Elite World Cup. And a couple of days before, they would have qualifiers to pare the field down. So super competitive. So when, the most satisfying thing about winning a race is who your competition is. The more competitive it is, the more guys you're beating, I think the more satisfying it is. So those races, having one in Europe, right, it's a little tougher. You go over there, you have to adapt to the travel and the different food and stuff like that. So those races were big, and it was a long time until somebody won one after that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds like we need to have more World Cup races here in the U.S.
Yes, absolutely. That's a good point. So Snowshoe and Mount St. Anne were the 2 that we have in North America now, but we need them on more variety of terrain. We should have one in the West, and hopefully that will be coming.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us a little bit about the test track in Durango. That's an area that's now known as Overend Mountain Park. Did you help build the original trails that were there? And what were you testing on the test track?
That's a good question. First of all, they call it Overend Mountain Park because I owned 60 acres that are over on that side of park that are part of what they call test tracks, right? I still have a hard time calling it Overend Mountain Park.
Yeah, it must be weird having a park named after you, but you're still around.
It's strange, yeah. I think my son gets a kick out of it. So I was running on those trails. It's a shale. It's kind of a gray shale dirt, which is very easy to make a trail in. If you ride down the hillside, it leaves a track, and you've already started a new trail. But it's pretty smooth, so there's a ton of flow in those trails. Yeah. It's less rocky than any other part of town because it's a different kind of dirt. But I own 60 acres over there because it was sold to me by a friend of mine. I was saying, okay, well, I will, maybe I'll build a house on it. And because it was raw dirt right on the edge of town, I soon found out that developing like one house on this, the city wasn't going to let me do it without oil. You have to put like sidewalks. You have to have a street with a turnaround. And so it quickly turned out I was not a developer. But I had the opportunity to sell it to the city for basically what I paid for it, and require that it be preserved as an open space. And it was added to by other acreage that were owned by other people that sold it to the city. And they preserved the whole thing. But the fact that a big part of it was property that I had owned at one time. So that's when, somebody proposed that we change the name to Overend Mountain Park.
Yeah.
But all kinds of stuff was tested there back in the day, right? Because, I was running there before I was even into cycling. So some of the earliest stuff, probably like the RS1 RockShox Fork, which came out in 1990, was the first time I'd ridden it. I rode it in the World Championships. I mean, it had like, maybe 65 mil of travel, but it was a hydraulic fork. So with an air chamber as well. So an air and hydraulic fork. And there were some other bumper forks out there. I think Manitou and Scott might have had a bumper fork at that time. But this was the first hydraulic. So it was pretty interesting testing that fork in there. I mean, the early clipless pedals, when Shimano first made the SPD pedal, that was an interesting pedal to test, and a big step forward in performance of the mountain bike. The road racers were all using clip-in pedals, like I think the Time was one of the first road pedals, but Shimano made the first really good clip-in pedal.
For mountain biking. Is that specifically, was it one of the first for mountain biking that was a clipless pedal?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the first one I remember. Other people made some, but none of them could compare at all with the the spring-loaded design that Shimano had made with that SPD. There was other ones. There was an Anza, and Suntour had one, but they had the spring was a rubber grommet kind of thing, right? Yeah. So when you clipped out, you had to like squeeze the rubber. That was the spring you were clipping out against, releasing against, and those were really inconsistent because the change in temperature changed the spring tension. So, but the Shimano used a steel spring, and it had some issues with mud clearance, especially in the early days. It would jam, and you wouldn't get out at all when those things got muddy. But that, I mean, the brakes, especially, I remember when we first would get disc brakes, because there's some super steep downhill sections in Overend Mountain Park. So great for brake testing.
Yeah, I was going to say I've ridden there in the park, and there are some very steep trails. And yeah, I'm curious. I mean, are some of those the original trails that you were using too? I mean, was it basically you turned it over and those ended up being adopted as?
Yeah, absolutely. The running trails they had there, and those trails were actually, a lot of them were created by motorcycles.
Oh, okay.
People would ride dirt bikes over there. And then, it was right next to town, and dirt bikes were just tearing it up because it's pretty fragile, kind of dirt. Yeah. So finally they kicked motorcycles out of there, but the trails were pretty much created by motorcycles, I think. And they were tend to be a bunch of trails that are right on the top of the ridges.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then since then, Durango Trails has built some amazing trails through there and closed a bunch off, right? Because there was just too many. And we had to actually do a real outreach to the mountain bikers to try and get them to stop, just creating outlaw trails.
Yeah.
Which is, work for the most part. That's ongoing.
Right. Well, yeah. Are you one of the ones that's still riding the old trails saying, no, that was my favorite one you guys closed?
It's interesting. I mean, the politics of, we had trails in other sections of town that riders have made, and they're great trails, but they're outlaw trails. And the city has actually said, even if it's a sustainable trail, they'll say, we're not going to encourage this. We're closing this trail down. We're going to go out there and cover it up and put barriers up. And we're not giving you these trails because we are not, we do not want to encourage this people building outlaw trails.
Right.
Which is true. I mean, it's unfortunate to lose, and there were some good trails we lost to that kind of stuff. But you have to go through the right process, or it doesn't work. So.
Right. It's tricky for sure because, like you said, a lot of trails were originally created that way, and they were later made official. But if we keep doing that, we're going to run out of places to ride. So I've also read that you appeared in one of the first mountain bike videos ever back in 1988. And obviously today's videos are a lot different, a lot higher production value. And, we have drones, we have YouTube, we have all these things. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the idea of mountain bike films? Do you think any of them truly capture what mountain biking is about? I like that acronym that you shared, never forget the feeling. And to me, it's almost like, can you capture that feeling in a mountain bike video?
I don't think you can completely capture it. It's interesting. I find myself, even before the days of GoPro and drones, right? I would picture myself riding down a trail and having somebody else be looking through your eyes, right? Like maybe your wife. So people who don't have the physical ability, like my sister.
Yeah. My mom. I always think my mom. I'm like, oh, she doesn't get it. She doesn't understand because she's never done it. How could I show her?
Yeah. And, the kind of terrain that mountain bikes can ride through is incredible. And the kind of scenery you see and, the extreme angles for, both up and down. So, but it's really the feeling, the combined feeling of the physical effort, right, with the exhilaration, of the speed and the technique. And I think some films come pretty close to giving you that feeling, but you can never experience the whole thing, not without the physical exhilaration, right, of the work you're doing and the feeling of movement and everything. But there are some amazing films. My son is into filming, and we've done some filming together. And the combination of having a GoPro on the back of a bike, filming a person, and that person, having a GoPro on his front wheel, and the combination of having a drone. My son flies drones too. You can get some really incredible feel for riding. It's impressive what they've done. And not to mention all the crazy extreme videos, right? Like Red Bull Rampage and things like that.
So you mentioned some of the early brakes and shocks and pedals that you were able to test. What do you think's been the biggest innovation in mountain bike equipment over the years?
That is a difficult question because it's hard to pick one without the benefit of the other. Like full suspension. I started out as a motocross racer, raced in high school, motocross and hare scrambles. So I really appreciated full suspension. And I embraced full suspension early for cross country, right? Cross country was my sport, so I wanted to use full suspension in cross country. I used the FSR XC when I won the XTERRA Worlds in 98 and 99. But Specialized was always trying to get the World Cup team to use full suspension. But we wouldn't force them to, right? We wanted them to use full suspension because everybody basically at that time in the 90s were selling aluminum hardtails, right? And we're all hanging, all the manufacturers were using RockShox or Fox, and we are hanging Shimano or SRAM components on them, right? So it's hard to differentiate ourselves. So Specialized really wanted, we had 4-bar linkage, and we're working with Horst, on different suspension systems. But getting the cross-country World Cup guys, it wasn't efficient enough for them, So eventually we made in 2001, we had the first Specialized Epic. And that is a bike that has an inertia valve built into the shock. So when you hit a bump, the shock opens, and when you're riding on smooth ground, the shock closes again. So it's kind of a hardtail when it's smooth and more active when it's rough. And that was really an important bike. That was the first bike that won the World Championships as full suspension. Christoph Sauser was the guy who was riding it at the time. I had already moved on to XTERRA. But so I think full suspension has done a lot to make cycling more enjoyable, and increase the ability of what riders can do. And I live in Durango where it's rough. So in order to enjoy cycling, it's really nice to have a full suspension bike. I mean, in places like Michigan and other places like that, just having a high volume tire can be enough. But full suspension wouldn't be that much fun without disc brake.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're right how it all is connected. And once we had one thing, then that led to another development. And yeah, it is hard to pinpoint one thing. Although the suspension, I mean, the way you describe it, it almost sounds like magic, right? I mean, where you can have a bike that rides like two different bikes without any input from the rider, really. And so, yeah, so many great things about bike innovation. So my final question for you is about trails. You have a favorite trail in Durango?
What ends up being my favorite trail is kind of what mood I'm in, right? Because sometimes you're not in the mood to ride a rough trail, right? You don't have the energy, you don't have the flow, like you're not relaxed or something like that. So different days, it's kind of different trails. But there is a trail in Test Tracks or over in Mountain Park called the Spirit Trail. And I really never get tired of it. It winds its way. It's up against the edge of the cemetery in Durango on the west side of town. So it winds itself kind of around. You can see gravestones from it, and the grass fields of the cemetery from different spots of the Spirit Trail. But it's up and down. It's not really long climbs, but you go up just enough that you can really accelerate, through different turns coming up. It's got a ton of flow to it. And it's probably a 15-minute trail section in part of that park, but it's my favorite. It always puts a smile on my face for sure. Not that hard, but it's easy to keep momentum on it.
Great answer. Well, Ned, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. It was a real honor talking with you, and thanks for all that you've done for cycling.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. I've been the benefactor of the development of mountain bikes and trails and everything. So I feel very lucky. But it's been good talking to you.
Absolutely. Well, if you want to get more information about Spoketober, we'll have the link for that in the show notes. That's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.